Hello everyone, and welcome to the History Neeks podcast, brought to you by Lou Davies.
James Allen.
And Joshua Quays.
We've been hit.
We've been gone a while. Let's just put it that way.
Yes, we have. We've had exams, we've had holidays, but we're back now, and this episode is the biggest misconceptions of World War II.
Pretty neat, huh? Anyway, just to get us rolling, I poked around the internet earlier. I know, worst idea I've ever had in my entire life. And, well, I found a few World War II misconceptions which I just looked at and thought, absolutely bloody stupid. So, I'm just going to run through the list. Firstly, that World War II lasted 4 years. Yeah, no, it basically was exactly 6 years, okay? It started September 1st, 1939, and then Japan surrendered on September the 2nd, 1945.
Where
do people get 4 years from?
I think maybe, I assume maybe, perhaps, or maybe, maybe there's a misconception with when Germany surrendered, but again, I'm not sure where these are coming from. That's why I'm listing them off. They're dumb.
I mean, many argue that it started in the old 30, or as early as 31 with Japan's invasion of China. But
so I don't know where they're getting 4 years from.
But I think a reliable date is when they invaded Poland.
Yeah, but don't worry, they get more stupid as we keep going along. Secondly, that apparently the US had as many casualties as the other allies.
I can swear they had 40,000.
America suffered the least out of.
I can swear
absolutely
when we carpet bombed Dresden, we killed 5 times the amount of people that America lost in the entire war.
I mean, America had no, apart from Pearl Harbor, they had no bombing.
And
I mean, Britain had some bombing, but Russia the Soviet Union suffered 20 million.
Yeah, I found 24 million.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Died there.
Let's see. Thirdly, that Normandy or D-Day was the biggest battle. No, I'd say Stalingrad.
No. I think a lot of these come under the idea of America being the most important.
Yeah, that does feel like, because a lot of these ones, they did say from the US point of view, or the US won the war. It's no, the Allies.
Even from a US point of view, surely the Battle of Midway or the naval battle would have been bigger, considering the amount of men committed.
Yeah, I think you can't argue that. I think America definitely had the biggest impact on the war against Japan, but in terms of the war against Germany, I think even Britain had, and certainly Russia had much bigger impacts, because for one, Britain survived the whole of 1914-41 pretty much on their own, and two, there was a lot of the understated things that Britain did, such as cracking the Enigma code, which some say shortened the war by 2-3 years. And then also they completely won the spy war against Germany. So,
Yeah, it's not exactly a fair argument to say America had the biggest impact.
No.
Yeah. Let's see. Fourth, and okay, this is a slightly interesting one, is that the Allies defeated the Axis powers against great odds. And it's well, that was the case until Russia and America got involved. It's when it was really...
I would say that was the case until Nazi Germany realised that it couldn't properly make mechanised forces. If they had mechanised their army and been able to sustain it with oil and fuel necessary, maybe that would have been true.
Yeah.
But in truth, I think mechanisation in Nazi Germany only reached about 35%.
Yeah, it was
really low.
The thing is, I think one of the biggest things about World War II is a lot of strategy was motivated by resources. So one of the reasons why Hitler invaded Russia, partly was because of his ideology of hating communists and Russians, but also because he wanted, the oil in the Caucasus. That's why he went to Stalingrad instead of pushing on to Moscow. But and also to say that, so obviously Britain was on its own for a long time, but I think there was almost no way Germany could have invaded Britain. There's the British Navy was always going to be leagues ahead of the German Navy, and then also British air power was also far more formidable than the Luftwaffe, because the Luftwaffe was also fighting in Russia at the time. So
what didn't help the Luftwaffe either was that was the very, very bad reporting by pilots of how many planes they'd shot down.
Yeah.
When they often claimed they'd shot down planes and destroyed them, they'd only ended up doing minor damage. Meaning, when the Luftwaffe claimed the RAF must be on its last legs and is close to defeat, we actually have more planes than when we began the war.
Yeah.
So it's very, very inaccurate reporting. Didn't have the Luftwaffe either, meaning that generally we won the Battle of Britain because of, general knowledge, but also there was no practical way for Nazi Germany to ever land a significant amount of troops on Britain anyway, as we were saying.
Yeah.
The Kriegsmarine were never up to the task.
No.
They could have never done anything about it.
Because I think the best hope, because I mean Hitler didn't want to invade them. One, because he knew that it was going to be almost an impossible task, and also because of his Aryan ideology, British people were alright for him, I guess. But
Yeah.
I don't think we can really know much about what went on in his head.
No.
We can only really guess at that one.
Yeah.
But anyways, just still going down this list. Let's see. Hitler was a military genius.
No.
No.
So many errors. I mean, one was in the Battle of Britain when he decided to start bombing
Like London.
instead of
the actual airfields, yeah. So then we were able to get back on our feet, win the Battle of Britain, and it's just like, great, well, get off our country.
Even then, though, I've heard before that even if they did target airfields, it wouldn't have made much difference.
No.
A bombing campaign against Britain, because our production was so spread out and much of it was concentrated in the north, which was slightly out of the reach of the Luftwaffe, it meant that a bombing campaign was actually a waste of resources.
Exactly.
They would have been better focusing their efforts elsewhere and consolidating their hold in Europe.
And then there's obviously the big one, which is Russia. And
Yeah.
I think, obviously, Germany, Hitler completely underestimated Russia, and because he expected to win the war by the end of the year in 1941. But so he didn't prepare them for winter clothing, and didn't prepare the German army for the harshness of the Russian winter.
I think before even that, the simple invasion of Russia was a pretty poor idea.
Because they had the Nazi-Soviet pact going on. They had a truce with them for a long while.
And also the Soviets knew they were in no state remotely to fight a war with Nazi Germany.
No.
Because, Stalin had executed almost all military leaders in the purges.
Yeah.
They didn't have a command structure, meaning they were in no state to actually fight a war. It's why Hitler decided not to just say... the Soviet Union had actually sent more resources than what Nazi Germany had asked for quite a few years before.
Yeah.
And under the Nazi-Soviet pact, they were consistently sending them resources. If Hitler had simply asked for more, they probably would have given it without even questioning it. It's...
Yeah, and then another thing was when Hitler thought that he was going to win Russia, he diverted military production towards planes for the Battle of Britain instead of focusing on tank production and for the Eastern Front. And he just made error after error. I mean, the Blitzkrieg was a good idea for the time because it caught kind of the
it did. It was quite effective.
It was innovative for the time, but it couldn't work in. It didn't really. It worked initially in Russia, but when it came to that kind of attritional warfare, like in Stalingrad and then later in the Battle of Kursk, they couldn't do anything.
It didn't really work, and I think probably at some point they may have clocked on how Blitzkrieg worked.
Yeah.
I think the other thing with Blitzkrieg as well, though, was that certainly it will work well against smaller countries that were neighbouring Germany, like France, Netherlands, Poland, where you could conquer them by land very, very quickly. But with a large country like the USSR or a country over the sea like Britain, the strategies wouldn't work.
No.
I think he tried to do something that was just unachievable.
Anyway, so we've got two more left on this. This one is just, we've sort of already covered it, but the Allies won due to America's military strength. I mean, credit for... Okay, maybe not credit, just... how do I put this? Just they did the A-bombs on Japan.
Well, I think you've got to give America a lot of credit for like the Lend-Lease ideas. Like the Battle of the Atlantic is probably one of the most underrated battlefields of the war because a lot of it kept Britain going during those years, and I
think it was less America's military strength and more their logistical strength that really supported the war effort. Because Britain would not have survived without American resources.
No.
That is that we can say that quite certainly. Did they do it out of the goodness of their heart? Not really.
No.
Or profiteering.
And they gained a lot of military bases.
The destroyers for bases agreement, where we gave up our overseas bases and they gave us their old destroyers.
Yeah. And obviously you can't deny America had
They definitely had an impact, of course.
On Japan, especially on Japan. I mean, they were.
It's like, I think we have at the start of the war. We have to remember though that the British Navy in the Pacific was the biggest fleet assembled at any time up until that point.
Yeah.
So you can't really, certainly against Japan they were the biggest impact, but on the war overall,
yeah,
I can't say that they were.
Again, that just takes. I feel like this was made by a very sort of. This claim was probably made by a pretty like anti-communist sort of style person.
Something you have to consider as well is what the Japanese feared the most at the end of the war was the USSR.
Yeah.
Because they had seen what they had done to Germany and they knew that they could do it to them as well, and they had the production to do it. It's been suggested before that the atomic bombs were completely unnecessary and they would have surrendered because
they were just overwhelming force against them.
Yes. And when the USSR declared war, was it that December?
No, it was in 1945.
Yeah, that's what I mean. At 1945, that in December, was it?
No, it must have been 1944. Yeah.
It was after Germany surrendered.
Yeah. It was when the USSR declared war. It was suggested that was the point where the Japanese government were willing.
I think it was in between the two atomic bombs, but and I think a lot of the misconceptions have arose kind of the politics post World War II and kind of out of the Cold War.
I think part of it's been particularly allowed to bloom because America and the USSR both emerged from the Second World War, the world superpowers.
Yeah, but one of the biggest, I think, misconceptions for me is the idea that Russia only won the war just through sheer massive numbers, and I mean obviously they when they brought their Siberian troops over, they did outnumber the Germans, but it wasn't exceeding the amount.
Most of the 24 million in casualties were civilians.
Yeah, and also they didn't just throw waves. They actually had good battle tactics. Like they used artillery very well. They had very good production. The T-34 tank was just a very reliable, very good tank. And a lot of people, talk about the German tanks like the Tiger. Yeah, it was a good tank, but
in Russia and Russian winters, it wasn't built for that.
It would always break down, and it was very hard to repair it because it was a very complicated machine. Whereas, the Sherman and the T-34 tanks, although they might not have been as good, you just mass produced those and just and they were reliable.
The particular thing with the T-34 was that it was very, very standardised, the parts it used. They could mass produce as many of them as they wanted, and they could almost guarantee, because they were produced in the same mass production factories, that if let's say a clutch broken one, they could just take it out of an old one and put it in a new one.
Yeah.
It was very interchangeable, and that's what German technology lacked. Every tank had its own parts in its own way, and was very over-designed and over-complicated when it really didn't need to be.
No.
And that also added to weight as well. You often got stories of German tanks that were just sinking in mud.
Yeah.
Because they were too heavy. They were not designed to travel over really thick mud or hard terrain, because they just were too heavy for it. And then you often got the vanity projects that Hitler seemed to like a lot, like the Mouse and the Rat, which were two super heavy tanks.
Oh yeah.
Had no place. Like the Rat. I think the Ratter.
Yeah.
And it was. All it would have been was a nice big target for a bomber.
Yeah.
It had no place on a battlefield. They couldn't even get the Mouse they did build. They couldn't even get to move.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so
and
waste.
There was another one. I think there's this massive artillery piece called the Gustav, which
the Gustav
it was huge.
Yeah.
No, it was. They took it. No, it wasn't Stalingrad. It was. They used it in the siege of.
What's it called?
In Crimea, Sevastopol, and then because
was it the railway guy?
The only way they could transport it was from railways, so it was a logistical nightmare to actually transport it anywhere.
The other issue it was as well was that the USSR used a different gauge of track to German track, meaning when they wanted to bring any railway items to or from the USSR, they had to change the railway as they went along. So just, why would you use railway at that point? And rely on technology that was fixed to a railway. I think one of the biggest problems, with the Kriegsmarine, certainly they built huge battleships, Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, Bismarck, Tirpitz, but and a lot of people just look at them and think, oh wow, that's amazing. They were actually very, very outdated ships.
Yeah, Bismarck was just a vanity project. It's just
the thing is they failed to update conventions and were still using World War I type designs, whereas Britain and France and even France had moved on and were using dual mount artillery, so capable of dealing with aircraft and other ships. They hadn't done that at all and still using separate artillery pieces, meaning that the ships became very, very heavy, and their displacement increased a lot, completely unnecessarily, and radar was very, very poor on them as well. It was suggested that when the Bismarck fired its guns, it actually broke all its radar.
Yeah.
The Kriegsmarine designs were not very good.
Yeah, I just want to bring on to it. It's a different point, but it's about France during the war. So there are quite a lot of misconceptions about France during the war, and one of the biggest perceptions of France were the surrender monkeys.
Yeah, so that's resulted in a lot of racism.
I think it's a slightly unfair. It's slightly unfair because France did. They did fight. They fought a long time in Battle of France, and it was. I mean, and you got to understand that Britain was also in France. Like Britain also had
Dunkirk.
Yeah. And I think Britain were lucky that they were an island, whereas France had that hot.
Well, just right next door.
That's at the same. Yeah, I think it is unfair to just call them outright surrender monkeys. They weren't aware of the Nazi tactics. Even we believe they wouldn't. I think the Nazis managed to push the coast in about 2 days.
Yeah,
the thing is, France sort of prepared for World War One style trench warfare again, and that just didn't stand much of a chance against these newer tactics.
Yeah, exactly. Even we believed back in Britain that should we fight on land, we were still training our home guard on World War One tactics.
Yeah.
If we'd been in France's position, we would have collapsed as well.
Exactly.
It's not fair to just outright call France surrender monkeys when of course.
Yeah. It is sort of this case like Britain's best assets. It wasn't really our manpower. It was our aircraft and our navy. Yeah.
But to criticise France. Because you always got to be balanced.
I think the Maginot Line is probably the first thing we have to address.
Absolutely.
Yes, let's build a really, really good, really strong fortified line, but leave a piece of forest because we think they won't come through there.
Good idea.
Slightly questionable strategy there. Had the Maginot Line actually gone all the way around, it may have actually held back Nazi Germany for quite some time.
Yeah.
And another issue is that on preparing to invade France, there was almost a military traffic jam that Nazi Germany created when they were lining up all their tanks. French reconnaissance craft did spot this, but the French Prime Minister refused to accept that it was actually going to be an invasion. Should they have sent over bombers, they would have been able to decimate a large portion of the Nazi force, but refused to do it.
Yeah.
So they just didn't believe it was an invasion.
Yeah, and a slightly different point about France is the impact of the French resistance. Now, a lot of this has to do with the Charles de Gaulle, who was the leader of the Free French, who greatly kind of exaggerated the impact France had on D-Day and against Germany. Yes, France did do some fighting in North Africa, but the French resistance. If they weren't there, I would think the outcome would have been
still win, because it is just sort of a small resistance group.
And also, France weren't as compared to the Yugoslavia, who managed to actually overthrow the Nazis themselves. There wasn't that hatred of Nazis in France. I mean, there was the French Foreign Legion. A lot of French soldiers actually fought against against Russia because they just hated communists. And they would rather Nazis than communists. And also in Vichy France, about 90% of French people supported the government. Now Vichy France actually fought against the allies in Africa as well. So I think this comes from that idea of kind of like the war guilt, because I mean Truman actually wanted to treat France as a conquered power because he hated Charles de Gaulle. But Churchill managed to convince him not to treat them as a victorious power, because they wanted a strong France to oppose in Europe to oppose communism.
But anyways, so I'll move on to to this final one here. And it's like, for America, World War II was a white man's war, which is just oof.
That's just racist.
Yeah, that's just straight up. They were like, I found this number. There were like 1.2 million Black Americans served in World War II.
Yeah.
And I think that's out of like, I guess 16 million US troops. Like, yeah, it's clear there's a white majority, but that's just completely like undercutting like the impact Black Americans
might kind of know what that's trying to get at. I think it's suggesting that they were fighting for freedoms that they would never have, or well, didn't get for about 2 decades later.
Yeah.
And even then, well, discrimination still exists today.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the obviously nothing compared to Holocaust, but a lot of the initial laws that Germany passed for the Jews, America was practicing themselves. I mean, Hitler actually supported America's treatment of black people, which shows that if Hitler's supporting it, then it's.
And at the same time, he was arguably less racist than America when he shook hands with the black athletes.
Jesse Owens.
That's it.
When
Jesse Owens.
The president didn't.
Yeah, so it's like
madness.
Yeah, there's a point when you're slightly more racist than Hitler.
Yeah, but with that point though, at the end of the day, when people were fighting for just the freedom to. Well, just freedom itself, and not wanting to be under a highly authoritarian Nazi regime. It's not just a white man's war. You're fighting for the freedom of every single person.
Yeah, I think one of the big things about World War II is often shown as a war between bad and good versus evil, and it's very easy to fall into that narrative because the Nazis were pure evil. Like there is not much argument to say that the Nazis were redeemable, but. A lot of the stuff the Nazis did, the Allies did as well. An authoritarian regime that massacred people. The Soviet Union was doing that. The Nazis, setting up concentration camps and
Stalin had been doing that for a while.
Britain was.
And they did. Britain did that. What was it? No, it wasn't the Boer War. No, it was.
What's the Boer Wars in South Africa?
Yeah, that's when we started using.
And then, race laws against the Jews. America was doing that. So, it is very easy to fall into that narrative. But
I think it's also equally easy to fall into the narrative that because the Nazis were evil, every single German citizen was also evil.
No, I wouldn't. Don't try not to follow that. A lot of German citizens, they were duped. They saw Hitler came along and said, "I'm going to solve all of your problems," and what did they do?
Most Germans didn't vote for Hitler because of his anti-Jewish rhetoric. They voted for him because they wanted jobs.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, there's.
I think people have to remember the German economic policy is actually quite close to what we have in Britain today. Yeah. Economically, they were very left wing. They had a welfare state that's bigger than what we have in the UK today. They had huge pensions, and generally for the average person, it meant that life actually was pretty right under them.
Yeah, except for every minority under the sun.
Yeah.
But I think something you have to consider as well is that the Nazis did operate a secret newspaper, and just general disinformation. This population was not really told what was going on. Most people didn't know about concentration camps and didn't know about how badly people were treated. And it's not like today. I think people assume it's like today where information's so free, but it's not. The only place you could get your information from was a newspaper.
Yeah, and also I think you have to separate the idea of the Wehrmacht and the SS. So obviously the SS were, carried out most of the war crimes, but the Wehrmacht, there was nothing legally so if a German soldier in the Wehrmacht refused to carry out a war atrocity, there was nothing. There was no
Nothing you could
repercussions
do.
for him. Like it was against like the policy that they would be punished for disobeying an order to carry out a war crime. But obviously, then again, a lot of people did in the Wehrmacht actually just volunteered to carry out these war crimes. So it's never black and white, yeah.
Yeah, so some others, as you said though, I have heard plenty of stories from all over Germany of people in the Wehrmacht being shot because they refused to carry things out by men from the SS.
Yeah.
So it's sure why it probably wasn't by law, where it was probably still enforced to some degree.
I mean, another thing is, this is a different point, but it may not be a misconception, but it is a thing that isn't taught, which is Japan. Kind of Japan's role in atrocities during World War II.
They definitely did some.
I mean, we touched upon it in the last.
Was it the last one?
With Mr. One.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
what Japan did during World War II, and even before that with the Sino-Japanese War, even you can compare them to the Nazis, the worst of the Nazis did. I mean,
I can't remember the particular city, but they dropped plague bombs, as they've been termed, and it was literally one of the first examples of biological warfare. Yeah. And they introduced bubonic plague into cities to just kill as many Chinese as possible and cause as much suffering as possible.
And then there was the rape of Nanking, where almost every woman was raped and then just killed, with pregnant women being stabbed, where the baby was, and then there was another thing I heard was that Japan would have these comfort women.
Yeah, they had a lot of sex, basically sex slaves.
They're basically sex slaves where they just kidnap
young women
from from their colonies, from Philippines and China.
The Japanese also set up, like Germany, huge concentration camps, especially for Chinese and Philippine people.
I might be wrong in I feel like there was there's one last comfort girl that is either still alive or died very recently. Nice little fact for you people.
But for some reason, Japan's, I think a lot of it's to do with America. So Douglas MacArthur, it was him. He actually, the notorious section, those doctors that performed experiments on people. Do you remember that? I can't remember their name, but they performed horrific experiments on these. On Chinese people in particular, and Douglas MacArthur actually pardoned them, and because it's actually the thing that happened in Germany as well, where
people were taken from the camps at Auschwitz and Birkenau.
Yeah,
and there was often, I think one of the most famous experiments, obviously people were often castrated to prevent it from reproducing.
Yeah, but a lot of those scientists in Germany and in Japan were pardoned and sent to America to work there, and played a part in kind of nuclear.
The Manhattan Project and whatnot.
Unfortunately, while what they did was horrific, some of the knowledge they gained in medical science is useful in some way.
That's usually the sad case.
There's stuff. What they did was disgusting and useful and morally completely wrong.
Yeah.
It's just awkward that America decided, let's pardon all these people.
Another thing is, that they kept the emperor in charge. I think his role in Japanese their nationalism is really understated. Like, he sanctioned the rape of Nanking. He was the embodiment of Japanese nationalism, and he wasn't going to complain about how Japanese.
You have to think as well that the emperor to the people was a godlike figure.
Yeah.
He was essentially the embodiment of God in Japan.
Yeah.
If you were to oppose the emperor, you were to oppose your god. So it didn't really work. You had to do it.
This is a time when nationalism was high. They'll take this guy at every word. There was no more shoguns or whatever.
You would think that if the Soviet Union had conquered Japan, that they would have got rid of him. They would have got rid of
every single piece of hierarchy Japan had. It'd be an incredibly different country today.
Yeah,
Whereas
today, they still have emperors and all that, but a prime minister as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more of a figurehead.
Yeah.
Much like the Queen has said.
But anyways, when it comes to these misconceptions, you now know how wrong they are, so I'm just gonna...
Where's the bin?
I mean, we don't have one in this room.
Okay.
So I'm gonna have to...
Anyway, I think that looks like that's an end to our podcast. Thank you for listening, and hope you are safe, and hope you have a good time.
Goodbye.